All right. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on human trafficking in the housing sector. My name is Kevin Connelley. I'm the Corporate Relations Manager at Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking, or BEST. We're going to cover a lot today on human trafficking. I want to really try and bring this to your industry and help you understand how this impacts you and what you can do to prevent or identify human trafficking if it ever comes across your path. So first, I just wanted to start with a little bit about our organization. BEST is a nonprofit that began back in 2012 during a conversation in Seattle regarding, what was missing in human trafficking prevention. A lot of leaders kind of got together and it was concluded that businesses were largely missing from that piece. Businesses have a lot of influence, they have a lot of power in the community, and they can really generate a lot of change. So our executive director started BEST back in 2012 in order to address that. Since that time, we've grown quite a bit. We have folks being trained in every single state every year, and anywhere from 4 to 6 other countries around the world. So our training reaches tens of thousands of people every year, and our message reaches millions. We have quite a big reach on social media. So we really focus on 4 main pillars. The first is awareness. So very similar to what we're doing today, we really try to talk to as many folks as we can, as many different groups as we can, help them understand what human trafficking is, what are the misconceptions, and how it really impacts them and what they can do about it. Second is consultation. So we consult with a lot of different businesses on best practices, what they can do in their business. If they need something that's tailored specifically to them, we help them understand how to do that. Training as well. So we really specialize in training. It's kind of one of our main focuses. We have a hospitality training. We have a maritime and aviation training that we designed with the Port of Seattle back in 2019. We also have a training for attorneys that actually offers CLE credits. Then we also have done a lot of training with the rideshare industry. And we've done some stuff with travel and transport, with tech. And then through our Safe Jobs Collaborative, our last pillar, we've also done some stress, trauma, and resilience trainings. But Safe Jobs is a really interesting program in BEST. And the Safe Jobs Collaborative is a program that connects survivors of human trafficking to safe and reliable employment opportunities in the King County and Seattle area. So that's sort of the main pillars that BEST focus on. All right, so important to start from the very beginning, what is human trafficking? So for human trafficking, there are 2 types. The first is sex trafficking. So this is a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or anytime a minor is induced to perform any kind of sex act. So force, fraud, and coercion, so I'll break those down. So the first one, force, someone being held against their will. This is normally how sex trafficking it looks like in media. There's chains, there's bars, they're being kept forcibly. This is not often what sex trafficking looks like. The third one, coercion. So the threat of violence or the threat of something happening to someone is often what sex trafficking looks like more often. So it's really more of a psychological fear than a physical threat. And then the third is fraud, which we see a lot in labor trafficking. So fraud is often when someone has a job opportunity, they're lied about it, or they're given false pretenses around what that will look like. So with labor trafficking, it is similar to sex trafficking in the sense that, you can use force, fraud, or coercion, but in this case, you're compelling someone to work against their will. Now, we hear a lot about sex trafficking more often, and we're gonna focus a lot on sex trafficking in this webinar today. But I do want to emphasize how common labor trafficking is, and a lot of times, especially within nonprofits and non-government organizations, it's estimated that there is more labor trafficking than sex trafficking. It's just the tools to identify labor trafficking cases are not quite there. We're still kind of a little bit behind in that. So labor trafficking can look like a lot of different things. But this is one case that I particularly wanted to bring up. So this was Giant Labor Solutions, which they had a few spots in Wyoming and in Minnesota and a few places in the Midwest. And they had a third party labor broker hiring folks from different parts of the world. And they hired them for various reasons. And they brought them here. And suddenly they weren't given the jobs that they were promised. They were forced to work in hotels, cleaning rooms, and acting as security. Now, this was dozens of workers that were trafficked into the United States. And they were there for, some of them for more than 3 years. And so a lot of folks say, why didn't they leave? Well, a lot of it goes back to that coercion. Many of them were threatened. Some of them, their families were threatened. A lot of them did not speak very much English. They didn't know the laws in our country. They didn't know how to go to the police. There was just a lot of barriers for them. So this is something that often comes up in trafficking. It's like, why didn't they leave that situation? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Now with sex trafficking, oftentimes victims are underage. So this is a picture of a young woman named Danica, who was being trafficked in Federal Way, Washington, when she was 17. And she was living with her mother. And her mother did not know that she was being trafficked and controlled by a pimp at the time. She didn't realize it until Danica disappeared. And she has not found her since. So this is often the case. There doesn't have to be, there can be a lot of problems that are happening at home, domestic abuse, a lot of different things, but sometimes someone can just be coerced into a situation against their will. So the market for commercial exploitation, I kind of want to break this down a little bit and talk about how this happens. So first we have the buyer. All commercial sex starts with a buyer. I think there's a misconception that, a prostituted person is there trying to find sex. No, it's always the buyer who creates the demand, okay? So the demand happens first. Then the promoter comes in, the promoter, the trafficker, the pimp, whatever you want to call them. They come in to meet that demand, and they control a prostituted person. So that promoter is controlling the prostituted person, and that buyer is exploiting the prostituted person. Now, there doesn't always need to be a trafficker or a pimp for human trafficking to occur. In which case the buyer is the trafficker. So there are many cases in which, youth have exchanged sex for a place to stay, food, housing, anything that they need to survive. And in that case, the buyer becomes the trafficker. So here in King County, it's estimated that there's 500 to 700 children trafficked every year. The adult number it's really difficult to actually collate that number, but from a lot of the service providers that we work with, we hear that they have to constantly turn people away or put them on a waiting list because there's such an enormous backlog of folks requesting services. So this is something that's happening very, very often. This is a graph from Polaris, which is one of the largest human trafficking organizations in the country, for cases that they had reported to their national human trafficking hotline. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of cases being trafficked here, but these are just cases reported to the hotline. These are not cases that have been reported directly to 911, cases reported directly to any service providers or nonprofits. So if we were to add those figures in here, there would be a lot more red space on this map. Okay, so the next is just trying to understand, who is a little bit more about who is being exploited and who is doing the exploiting. So as you can see, the defendants, so CSEC is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So in this case, we're talking about minors who are being trafficked. So 100% of the time, it's men. And while this data is particular to King County, we see this very same statistics all across the country. I've heard anywhere from 98.9 to 100% of the defendants are men. Now, there are women who traffic folks, but we've not really seen cases where women are buying sex. And then for the victim gender, we see that it's 82% girls and 18% boys. So this is another misconception in that boys are not a part of this picture. But as you can see, they very much are. There's been a lot of recent research that's been done that has shown that this is another area that is lacking in our understanding of human trafficking, and the fact that boys are very much being victimized and being trafficked all across the country. So prostitution also perpetuates racial violence. So as you can see, the buyers here, or the defendants, are mostly white. Here in King County, buyers are mostly white. And we see that there are, compared to their population, especially among Black youth, they're disproportionately victimized, both Asian, Hispanic, and Black. Again, as you can see, we have a very small percentage of African Americans in King County, yet we get a very large percentage of Black victims, commercially sexually exploited victims here in King County. But we see the same thing for adults as well. Again, we see adults who are largely African American, while the population of African Americans in King County is relatively small. So what about the buyers? Where do the buyers work? We took data from almost 900 people who were caught buying sex from minors around the country. And we found that they come from a number of industries. However, we do see a large percentage in construction, transportation, warehouse, utilities, as well as IT. So really they can come from anywhere. So who is involved in human trafficking? So this crime can really affect so many different groups of people. I've heard stories all across the board, but there are certain groups that are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. First is anyone who is marginalized due to their race. So as we just discussed, folks of color are disproportionately victimized, both in King County and around the country. Second, anyone really experiencing homelessness, And the next one, people who identify as LGBTQ plus, really goes together there. So a lot of times someone who's LGBTQ plus can be kind of forced out of their home because they're not really accepted for who they are. And once they lose that support system and they're living out on the street and they're homeless, their chances for trafficking skyrockets. So there was a detective a few years back in the Seattle area who was a younger looking woman. And what she did was put on a backpack and she went to a few malls around the Seattle area. And every time she was tried to be picked up by a trafficker very, very quickly. So that issue of homelessness, not having that security, not having an environment to keep you safe, really increases the chances of trafficking. And then people experiencing poverty. Anyone who is put in that position and that vulnerability is created and someone is just trying to survive can really kind of push them into being into a trafficking situation. And the last is immigrants. Folks who come here, they might not be on the right visa. They might worry about if something happens to them. They're afraid to go to the police. They don't always understand the laws around the area that they live. So they're definitely a group that is a little more vulnerable to exploitation. Okay, so how do we identify exploitation? So actually, no, sorry, before we do that, indicators are something that's really popular. And a lot of nonprofits really like to talk about them. But before we go through the indicators, I just want to say that you might not ever see indicators. You could see someone being trafficked, but you might not see a lot of the indicators. So there was a great survivor expert that I listened to a few days ago named Christina Fitz, who was doing a webinar, and she had been trafficked, and she flew a lot. She flew all over the country. And she talked about how her trafficker was never really there with her. He was always there, but he never made his presence known. So they never communicated when they were going through airports. When they got to the new city, they went into different cars. He was very careful about making sure to not make his presence known. So I just wanted to preface this with these indicators are great to know. And also it's so important to just sometimes follow your gut. So the first indicator is distress. So a person might seem unusually anxious or fearful or abused, or they don't make eye contact. This is something that we see a lot and that we hear a lot from survivor experts, is that their trafficker told them to not make eye contact. Sometimes the trafficker will be there with them and will speak for them, and they won't be making eye contact. As I mentioned previously, that could be the case. It might not be. But this can be something that you might see. The second is control. So a person is being controlled, they're being assaulted, they're being threatened, or they're not receiving their pay. So a lot of times, especially in that labor trafficking case that I talked about earlier, what they will do is they will put you up in a house and say, we're just going to take the rent out of your pay, but they'll charge you an exorbitant amount for rent. So in the end, you actually end up not receiving any money. And they do this in order to control you. So keeping your pay is just another way of not allowing you to leave that situation. The third is confusion. So a lot of times folks are moved from place to place. Maybe they're not receiving the pay that they were promised. Maybe they're not receiving any pay. Again, this can happen to anyone. it can, it can happen to immigrants. It can happen to locals. I think a big misunderstanding is that trafficking only occurs to non-American citizens in the US, but that's actually not true. The majority, according to Polaris, the majority of trafficking victims that they see are actually US citizens. So the fourth indicator is sex buying. So anytime you hear someone discussing exchanging sex for money, that can be an instance of human trafficking. So when you identify trafficking, it's really important to focus on behaviors, not misidentify based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, or religion. And that's kind of why we break down the indicators the way we do, because we really want folks to just look at behaviors. There was a woman waiting at an airport bar about 1.5 years ago. And the bartender thought that she was not dressed appropriately for the situation. So he called the police and said that a woman was working as a prostitute at the bar. So the police came to the bar and questioned her, and it turned out that she was married to a pilot, and the pilot was returning back to that city, and they were going to meet at the bar. So that bar received a lawsuit because of that, because there was no questions asked, there was no conversation. It was simply based on someone's poor judgment. There was another case a few years back of Cindy McCain, who was talking to a group of folks and told them that she had recently identified a case of human trafficking in an airport. It turns out that she saw a family, and the family was multiracial, and she felt like something was off. So she told the police, and the police went and questioned the family. But they were simply a family. They were not, there was not a trafficking case happening there. So race is something that is constantly involved in the misidentification of trafficking. So again, this is just so important. Remember that always look at these stories always look at these indicators based on behaviors. There's one more story I wanted to share. There was a home in Snohomish County, and a few of the neighbors saw some younger looking girls repeatedly going into this home. And one day, one of the neighbors heard a man walking by talking about sex buying. And he'd seen the younger looking girls going in and out of the house, and he felt like something wasn't right. So he called the police, and the police came, and it turned out that several minors were being trafficked in this house. So in this case, a lot of times, and the person even said, it just didn't feel right. And so I think, we're not always going to get it right every single time, but it is important that if you do see these behaviors, if you do see a lot of minors interacting with, older folks who don't seem like they're related, it could very well be a trafficking situation like that was. Okay, so what happens if you do see a case of trafficking? What should you do? So we always kind of break this down into if the trafficker is present or if the trafficker is not present. So if there is a trafficker, a pimp, someone controlling someone else who's present, don't get involved. Don't ask questions, just call 911, let them know what's happening. If you're not sure, if you have, some questions, if it seems really unclear, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. but I really recommend just calling 911 and talking to them about it. They can always come and check something out. In Washington State, there are very strong laws against being sued over misidentifying a case like trafficking. No one can really go back against you and sue you for an unfounded suspicion like that. So please do report and keep yourself safe. If the victim is alone, if there is an emergency, always call 911, okay? However, if the victim is alone, there's no trafficker or controller present, there's no harm, there's no danger into the situation, just ask the person, are you okay? Do you need help? If they do need help, you can help them to call 911, you can help them to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. If they say no, it's really important to respect that decision. There could be a number of reasons why they don't want the police involved. But we think it's very important to just respect that and just let them know that if they need any help, that you can help them. Okay, so just a few really quick impacts from COVID-19 that we've seen. We've seen a really massive spike in cases of trafficking. A lot of these cases have happened from just the increase of folks spending time on the internet. So we've seen a lot of grooming happening over the past 2 years. And Polaris actually reported a 100% increase in cases in the last year. So we're seeing a lot more trafficking happen. And it's because mainly of push and pull factors. So people are often pushed into trafficking because of things like domestic violence, homelessness, civil unrest. And we've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of increased poverty. We've seen a lot of homelessness happen. We've seen a lot of people kicked out of their homes. And that has really pushed a lot of people into trafficking situations. And then we have these pull factors, right? So we see people looking for employment, looking for protection, looking for housing, looking for food, the things that they need to survive. And that is often what can pull an individual into a trafficking situation. So how can we prevent commercial sexual exploitation today? Well, here's back to this graph that we started at earlier. The biggest thing that we can do, the number one thing that we can start doing, and the men I'm talking to, are the specific group that I'm talking to. We need to stop buying sex. If we stop buying sex, we take away that demand, okay? Once the demand is gone, there'll be no need for a promoter, a pimp, or a controller. And once there's no need for a controller, a pimp, or a controller, people aren't going to be prostituted anymore. There's a quick story I'd like to tell you. There was a woman in the Seattle area several years ago who was kicked out of her home when she was 17. And she had a friend who said there was someone that could get her work. So she went with her, and it turned out that this person was a pimp and forced her into prostitution. She escaped later. She left the situation, and her pimp found her and brought her back. A few more months went by, and finally she came home one day, and her pimp badly beat her up and almost killed her. And she ended up in the hospital. And the police asked her if she wanted to leave. She said no. And she went back, and that night spent the night at a hotel and told the person at the hotel that she needed help. And so the police came back and they took her out of that situation. Several years later, she was speaking to groups about this, about her ordeal, about her trafficking situation. She was actually speaking to a business. And halfway through her speech, she realized that one of her buyers was in the crowd. This was a relatively small audience. He was slunk very far down in his chair, but she recognized him and he recognized her. And I think for some people that would create a lot of fear, but she felt very empowered instead. And for her, that was kind of flipping the situation and changing the narrative, that she was not being controlled anymore, and now she was in control. And I bring this story up because this is happening all the time. You know, this is not something that occurs in back alleys, in foreign countries. This is happening all the time here in Seattle and in the communities that we live. So how can you create change through your business? Well, the first thing that you can do is you can create a central policy for sex buying. So everyone should have a policy in their business for sex buying that says you are not using company resources and company time for buying sex, for going to strip clubs. This is an example of Amazon's own policy, and we have several policies on our website as well that you can use to create your own. But it's really important to have this policy because this happens all of the time. I have a former colleague who was in tech, but he also worked in trafficking prevention, and he was invited to a very large tech company in Seattle. And he told the group that he was speaking to that he could actually scrape the internet of the computers of the people in the building to see at that very moment who was searching for sex. And so they did a quick scrape, and there was actually 3 people in the building trying to buy sex online. So this is something that people are doing on company time. And so if you have a policy for this, this is something that you can absolutely prevent from happening. You can also create a code of conduct for your suppliers. So if you have a code of conduct, you can include a stance against exploitation or human trafficking, because your suppliers could be trafficking their labor, they could be exploiting people in their business, and you don't want to be supporting something like that. So we have sample language here that you can use. And again, we have more sample language on our website. So the other is your procurement and RFPs. So what you can do is actually create a procurement policy that has language that actually gives preferential status or treatment to suppliers who demonstrate their stand against sex trafficking or sex buying. And this is just another way to encourage people around you, encourage businesses in your community to also acknowledge this, to make their suppliers aware of it, and to kind of just spread the word that this is something that we care about, and this is probably something that you should care about as well. So we have some additional sample language here. The other is train your employees. We have a free basics training on our website. So if you go onto our website, which is bestalliance.org, you can watch it. It's about 20 minutes long. Any of your employees can go on and they can watch it. It's very simple to watch. Again, it only takes 20 minutes, and it really helps folks to understand, who trafficking how trafficking occurs, who it impacts, and what you can do as an employee to prevent it, and what you can do if you actually witness it. Finally, this is a statistic that I like to always bring up. 2 p.m., which is a peak time for buying sex on the internet. Now, you would think maybe 11 o'clock at night, for buying sex is something that occurs late, but this is unfortunately not the case. And this just goes to show that folks are using their company's resources to do this, because this is a number that comes up again and again and again. 2 p.m., right in the middle of the workday. So it's important to remember to implement these kind of policies and to make your staff aware of this so that they don't waste your time and your resources to procure sex. Okay, so just to kind of recap some opportunities that you have as a business, you can create internal reporting protocols or policies. You can build relationships with law enforcement, just so you know who's in your area. Some communities have a hotline number that you can call. Some communities have a specific detective that works specifically on trafficking. We have some great detectives in the King and Snohomish counties that you can just give them a call. In case you ever see anything, you'll know who to reach out to. And again, adopt company policies. There's a number of them that you can adopt. And again, we have those on our website. And lastly, implement training, whatever it is, and whichever industry that you work in. As I mentioned previously, we have trainings for hospitality, for rideshare, for aviation, for maritime, as well as a stress, trauma, and resilience training, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can become a Safe Jobs employer. So the Safe Jobs Collaborative is a great program, again, that we've been working on for about 4 years now. And we connect survivors of human trafficking to safe and reliable employment opportunities in King County. And we have nearly 20 employers now, all around the area in all different kinds of industries, who we hook up jobs for our clients that we work with. It's a fantastic program. So if you have a business or you work for a business and you have positions that you're constantly trying to fill, or you have internships that you'd like to fill, we're always looking for paid internships as well. But this is just a great program in general. You can get a lot of applications from qualified folks. We give you support all throughout the process. And then we also have stress, trauma, and resilience trainings for free that we can come to your workplace and actually provide those trainings for you. These are really great for managers, for understanding how to deal with employees who've gone through very stressful or traumatic situations. But it just offers some really great skills, some really beneficial skills for just understanding how to keep a very peaceful, very calm, and very productive work environment. And then finally, you can receive public recognition from BEST. We have a really big social media presence. We try to be really active, both locally and nationally, and we always do a lot of recognition for our Safe Jobs employers. And then lastly, it's just another way to meet goals for diversity and inclusion. I actually want to tell you read a quick quote from one of our Safe Jobs clients, who was a young person by the name of Jeffrey, who was 18 years old. And I just want to read you his testimonial. So we did a interview and resume workshop at Waldron. Waldron is an HR company here in Seattle, and they're a Safe Jobs employer. And so we held a workshop there, and he went to the workshop, and I just want to read you what he said. I attended the resume and the interview workshops at Waldron. The resume workshop was very helpful because they taught us how important resumes are and how to tailor our resumes for the jobs we want. I wanted a job in food service, so I made my resume all about my experience in the food service industry. Later on, my friend took me to a hiring event. I used the resume I made at Waldron and was asked to participate in an open interview. I made a point to use the skills I learned at Waldron, like reflecting on my previous work experience and highlighting my passions and future goals as a cook. In the workshop, they taught me to think before I speak during an interview so that I could organize my thoughts and give them the right information. At the end of my interview, they told me I was hired and that they would see me at orientation. I think the resume I made with Waldron helped me get the job. Having a new job has allowed me enough money to move into a new apartment. It is my very own studio with a washer and dryer, newly remodeled kitchen, and I can walk to work. The Waldron staff created a training space that felt safe and comfortable. The Waldron trainers were awesome because they were very knowledgeable on the resources we needed and explained things in a way that made sense. They did a lot for us and helped create a clearer road to success. So that was just one Safe Job participant, and we've had dozens over the years that we've supported in getting work and building a life that they wanted. So thank you so much. Here is my email address if anyone would like to contact me. I'm always available. I can talk to you about training. We can talk about the Safe Jobs Collaborative or any other ways that you would like to get involved in human trafficking prevention for yourself personally or for your business. So thank you so much.